Good afternoon and welcome to the Brighteye European Edtech Tour. And welcome to the UK, the 6th edition, and in the place where I actually am. My name is Hege and I'm Head of Community at Brighteye Ventures. I'm proud to say that we have a brilliant lineup today, on stage today. In our EdTech Founder panel, we have Slava from SendEducate, Zarja from MyTamarin, and Bertie from MyTutor to talk about scaling digital marketplaces for learning. For the investor perspective, Benjamin from edtechX, Shyan from ClearlySo, and Ryan from Public will share their views. Please remember that you can all ask them questions in the stage chat, and let us know who you are and where you're from. Before we dive in, my colleague Reese, our head of research, will tell you a bit more about our fund, as well as give you a good look into the European and EdTech funding and UK EdTech funding landscape. Take it away, Reese.
Thank you very much, Hege. Firstly, it's great to be here and speaking with you today. As some of you might know, Brighteye is the most active EdTech-focused fund in Europe, investing in 7 to 10 new companies every year at Seed and Series A. The companies that we work with help people learn and grow, and our interests span the early years to lifelong learning and everything in between. And we also have interests in related sectors too. Our team really specializes in helping companies to scale across countries, cultures, languages, and institutional barriers as well. Hopefully you can see my screen, and hopefully you've also seen our report that was out on Tuesday that considers the European VC funding landscape. It's usually an annual report, but we've seen so much activity in the first 6 months of the year that we wanted to share the good news and also to take a look at the emerging trends. And especially as we've made our way around Europe on this tour, we've seen the totals and activity ramping up really nicely. And a quick disclaimer, our figures were calculated prior to the Go student round, and given its size, it's probably best to proceed without it to avoid it skewing everything too much for now. But of course, we'll integrate that into future editions, and it's a fantastic thing for the sector. Of course, today we're both virtually and literally, in the case of most of the Brighteye team, in the UK. So we'll be picking out some of the most relevant findings and figures on the UK context, which we hope you'll find useful. So why are EdTech and learning tech companies so appealing, first of all? Well, in short, they're digitizing a previously analog sector, and that's true of education and learning in the broadest sense, in schools, colleges, universities, corporate and consumer. So it's making education and learning, as it says in the slides, more affordable, more relevant, more effective, and more engaging. And these are some of the pillars we consider when considering prospective investments. And the increases in investment activity show broadening recognition of these benefits. European EdTech VC investment is on course to more than double in 2021, from 711 million in 2020 to 1.8 to 2 billion in 2021. And funding thus far in 2021, only 6 months into the year, sits at just over $1 billion. And that represents 15 times growth in investment since 2014. And that's been raised across 111 transactions, which interestingly means that we can expect to see a similar total deal count in 2021 compared to 2020. And with the monster Go student round and a number of others closed this week, we're well on the way to 1.5 billion. More funding and a similar number of deals means that the average deal size is increasing after a period of relatively consistent levels. The average deal size thus far in 2021 is more than triple the 2020 level, including all rounds of all sizes, including seed. And on the distribution of round sizes, there is relative consistency in deal count across the 10 million plus ranges, which shows some positive signs of maturity in the market. And indeed, 21% of 2021 deals are therefore over $10 million. And the pipeline for further large rounds in 2022 looks promising too, given that 49% of deals thus far in 2021 have been in the $1 to $10 million range. So where has this activity been happening? Well, the funding landscape is really broadening. For the first time, Austria and the Netherlands take place in the top 6 countries and regions by total funding, driven by large rounds by companies headquartered in the markets. So, of course, Go Student in Austria and Studokje in the Netherlands. And this graphic, therefore, is more a representation of where the biggest rounds have taken place rather than where most activity has occurred. For example, France sits in pole position on this chart by total funding, but 200 million of the 223 million total has been raised in only 2 rounds. And those rounds are Ornica and Open Classrooms. The Nordics also appear on a roll with more than triple the level of 2020 funding already, which is really promising development. And so breaking this down, the UK leads the way by deal count with around 4 times the next individual market and around 2 times the nearest region. However, the average deal size in the UK is relatively small compared to the other markets. The UK's average deal size across the 40 transactions is 5.2 million compared to 9.1 million in the Nordics and a huge 27.9 million in France, which tells us that the UK is a very active startup hub with a flourishing ecosystem, but that few UK-based companies are currently raising the biggest rounds at the moment. But that's probably just because that's based on rounds that have happened this year. So of course we don't expect this trend to last very long. And looking now at the customer verticals, consumer edtech, it leads the way with 70 companies raising 718 million, and emerging themes include financial education, digital skills and skills boot camps. Corporate edtech sits behind with 48 deals with key themes including things like cybersecurity, employee and HR support and productivity tools, followed by K-12 and universities with 30 and 24 deals respectively, with key themes including teaching, learning resources, personalized learning and tutoring, student finance, and of course VR and AR. And now taking a quick look at the biggest rounds. The biggest rounds are, as it says on the slide, indeed getting bigger. Digischool raised the biggest round of 2016 at only 16 million. So we're seeing enormous growth in the size of the average rounds. And we think this is being driven by 3 factors. The first one, significant growth during the pandemic, is fueling valuation increases. There's increasing involvement of generalist funds, international generalist funds, some of which are from the US, like Andreessen Horowitz, Bolton, General Atlantic, etc. And the third factor is that remote learning and working is expected to continue to a greater extent than first imagined. We were until Tuesday going to say it's only a matter of time until the centaurs become unicorns, but of course that stampede, as we're cheesily calling it, is already happening. Go Students Monster Raise, of course, thrusts it into focus as Europe's first edtech unicorn, excluding companies that have IPO'd like Kahoot. And naturally, we've been delighted to see 7 deals over 50 million so far this year across 5 different European markets, including Open Classrooms in France, Lingoda in Germany, Labstrom Lumi in Denmark, Studocu in the Netherlands, and a member of the Brighteye family, Ornicar, in France. And there's several other companies that aren't on here that haven't raised rounds this year, but are also becoming, are growing very nicely and likely to become unicorns in the not too distant future. And of course, that means we're heading to a world in which there are more and more edtech unicorns that are being minted, hopefully in broadening geographies beyond the US and China, where currently 21 out of 25 current edtech unicorns are based in those regions. And the positive thing is that it's happening at an increasing rate, as you can see from the slides. The 7 companies have already become unicorns in the last 6 months. That's of course great to see. All of this is great to see. Another trend we hope will continue is the increasingly diversified path to liquidity. Conventionally, of course, as we all know, limited in the edtech space in recent years, with the only traditional buyers being publishing houses. But we're really starting to see a lot of interesting activity, such as strategic buyers, like Process acquiring Stack Overflow earlier this month. And we're also seeing past and present edtech unicorns becoming acquirers, like Baiju's acquisition of Akash and Kahoot's acquisition of Clever. So all in all, an incredibly exciting time to be in the sector, and we look forward to hearing more about it in the sessions that follow. But one slightly separate note, we obviously try, as with all of our research, to be as helpful to the community as possible. And as part of this work and our other wider stream, we're undertaking an internationalization survey, considering startups' experiences entering new markets. So if anyone in the audience would like to complete that, we'd be extremely grateful. I think Hege is going to share a link in the chat in a second. It'll only last 10 minutes, but that's it from me. Thanks for listening, and back over to you, Hege.
Thank you very much, Reese. That's super helpful, and the link is shared already in the chat. So please, people, fill it in. And then we're going to move on quickly to the next panel, the first panel, and I'm introducing my colleague Ben to the stage, and then letting the rest of the panel on to introduce themselves. And I'm going to disappear.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Hege. As the panelists are coming on, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Ben Worz. I'm a partner with Brighteye. I've been investing in EdTech since 2010 and co-founded Brighteye with my partner Alex in 2017 with the thought that it was time for smart capital for great entrepreneurs taking advantage of a lot of the changes in the way people learn here in Europe. And we've been off and running since then, and psyched to accompany some great entrepreneurs, including Slava, who's on with me. So just to disclose our relationship at the outset. But I'm really excited to hear from all three of the entrepreneurs here. I think are building very exciting companies. And so with that, I'll let you guys introduce yourselves. Maybe starting with Zarja, because I have a last name that starts with W, and I never get to go first. So I figure with a first name that starts with Z, you probably don't get to go first too often either. So I'm gonna let you go first this time.
Great, thank you, Ben, and I'm really glad to be here. Hi, everyone. So my name is Zarja. I come originally from Slovenia, and that's why my name is pronounced as Zarja, not Zarja, which is how an English native speaker would pronounce it normally. And I'm mentioning Slovenia because when I was growing up, every woman worked. Pretty much all my friends' mothers. In fact, I haven't had a single friend whose mother wouldn't work because we had childcare. We had childcare provided in the country. So when I moved into the UK, I realized that we don't have that. There is no really good infrastructure of childcare, and that's where a lot of women can't work. In fact, 25% of women do not work in this country because of childcare. And so that's what inspired MyTamarin, which is a complete and comprehensive platform for childcare for the contemporary parent. So we find the best childcarers, we train them, we vet them, we match them with the right families, and then we help manage this relationship end to end, so that parents can focus on things that matter, and that's the family, not the family. So thanks so much for having me here.
Great, thanks, Zarja. Slava, do you want to go next and just introduce yourself and tell a little bit about EdtechX?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm Slava. I'm an ex-banker, ex-consultant turned startup guy. My first foray into the startup world was actually a business called Nutmeg that was recently acquired by JP Morgan. In terms of EdtechX, we started 4 years ago. We're an online platform for temporary teachers and teaching assistants to work in UK schools. We disrupt traditional agencies who tend to be really poor value for money for both schools and teachers. They tend to work in only paper and analog form. And basically my origin story was I had a family member who worked as a supply teacher, and I thought it was insane. And I came from a tech background. And so we built something better.
Great. Thanks, Slava. Bertie, do you want to talk about yourself and MyTutor?
Sure. I'm the co-founder and CEO of MyTutor. We help make high-impact tuition more widely available. We're a team of about 150 and have helped hundreds of thousands of pupils already. We have both a sort of B2C consumer business where a parent can go and find the right tutor for their child. But we also work with hundreds of schools drawing on central budgets to make tuition more accessible and more affordable. So there's a combined model, and all the tuition is delivered online and by tutors who are close in age and have recent experience. So Zara, similar to you, do a lot on vetting and quality assurance, but ultimately have somebody who can really identify and relate to you. They've been through the same problems and challenges recently.
Great. Well, thanks, guys, and thanks everyone for being here. I think I get really excited about marketplaces in an education context. I think it's one of the most efficient ways to drive down costs and to improve educational experiences across a number of different, in a number of different ways, I guess. But one of the, marketplaces only really work if there are active number of participants, right? And when you're starting a marketplace company, one of the big challenges is always like once the network is up and running, there's value, but before the network is there, you're kind of selling the promise of a network without a lot of participants, and that's always hard. It's often referred to as the cold start problem. So would love to hear a bit about how each of you started off, how you solved that problem at the outset in terms of creating enough enough supply and demand to make the model work. And so why don't we just stay in the same order for now? I'll mix it up at some point, but sorry if you don't mind starting, that'd be great.
Yeah, so in our case, we very much started with the supply side. So literally our MVP was me scraping the best maternity nurses recommended by Hampstead Moms in Hampstead Moms Facebook group and amongst my colleagues at BCG, where I worked as a management consultant at the time. And so I guess I was creating the list of top maternity nurses and started shopping that around. I have learned over time that the ratio when parents are choosing childcare is the optimal ratio is between 5 and 6, meaning that you provide 5 to 6 choices to parents. If you provide less, it means that they're not going to feel certain that they have actually seen it all. If you provide more, they get into like too much choice. I can't make a decision mode. But anyway, that has always meant that we actually needed more supply at the demand side. So we always invested in childcares and always sort of in oversupply. And we could do that because we weren't necessarily penalized if we weren't able to find jobs for those childcarers, because they're not exclusive to us. They can continue to work elsewhere. But given that there is quite a bit of turnover in the market, and the childcarers will not stay in one job for a decade, we basically still have them in our team, and then they can cycle in and out. But the beginning was very humble. It was a PowerPoint list with 10 best maternity nurses.
So it was really just like 10 people, and then that's it. You hit the market, and that was enough to start kind of matching.
I mean, that was it, and
That's awesome.
it was enough for me to start learning.
Yeah.
And from there on, I knew, okay, how do we present actually those profiles, and how many choices do parents need to have, and how quickly do childcares become unavailable, or how long the parents take to choose. That always informed then how much demand and supply we needed to have in order to keep some good balance. Though the reality is we continue to be in an imbalance, because there's always a little bit more one or the other. But I think the key is to try to stay just a little imbalanced, not massively imbalanced.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Slava, what about you? We've been investors, obviously, but we were not investors in the very early days. I actually do not know this story. I don't know how you guys started to sort of attack this problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're very right, Zara, in that it's about understanding whether you're supply or demand constrained. For us, actually, we're massively demand constrained, so we needed to always come good for schools that requested somebody from us in the early days. We actually had various levels of hacks to do that. I think the first, which used to really annoy the team, is 4 out of the first 10 employees were qualified teachers themselves. So anytime we couldn't come good for a school with the list of contacts that we had, and it was very similar, we had a contact list, we'd send somebody out on the team that was a qualified teacher. I think the very first person to do this was a secondary maths teacher that got sent into a nursery for his first day of supply with Zed. So he came back telling us about all the snotty noses he had to wipe. So it was very fun. But even now, we still very much optimize on really making sure we get it right for schools. So our fill rate on short-term bookings is something like 98%. And we've moved on from having our own team do it, but we actually make lots of teachers exclusive to us to have that baseline level of reliability for schools. And we just can't afford to not come good for schools. I think we're literally the polar opposite of you, Zara, in terms of where the constraint is.
No, that's interesting. Is there anything you would do differently in retrospect from, I guess, at the early days?
I think probably the one thing I would most do differently is to get that demand flywheel spinning. I'd probably get an inside sales team sooner than we did. It's one of our best acquisition channels for getting demand going, and we did that 2.5 years in. Whereas probably if I did it again, I'd probably do it 3 months in. Because, and just to be clear, you would do that because those guys, basically, you just get so much more volume out of your existing schools when you have an inside sales team. Is that correct? Yeah, exactly. And get more new schools on board, which then just drives the supply side of the flywheel. So for us, supply is relatively easier compared to getting that demand going.
Got it. Okay, cool. What about you, Bertie? How did you guys start?
Yeah, lots of parallels to what the others said. I think in terms for us, the biggest hurdle to further growth was the rate of adoption of online learning. This is like very much pre-pandemic, tutorials entirely online, and so it was more expensive for us to bring on parents, and so we had to be more careful that when a parent came on board, we could service that effectively. To your question of like tactics, as it were, to sort of solve the cold start, I think we invested quite heavily in the relationship with our tutors. I mean, although it was online, if ever they came to London, we took them out for lunch. Like, we made a big effort, maybe not going as far as Slava as bringing him onto the team full time, but very much like really invested in sharing contacts where the business was going, just to sort of build patience for the supply side as we got the demand wheel going. So definitely over-indexed there. And then I think in terms of what we'd have done differently. It was very manual at the start, and there was a lot of, as soon as you had the demand, you'd call around everyone on the supply side to see who you could fit it in. I think scaling that sales force sooner probably would have helped us manage the demand side a bit better as well. So probably similar learnings for you, Slava, about how we could have made that smoother than it was.
Okay, cool. And so now I'm going to go back around the other way, Bertie. So I'll stick with you here. And one of the, I think probably the on-demand service that people are most familiar with, or one of the on-demand services that people are most familiar with, is like Uber or Lyft or on-demand grocery delivery, where honestly the service itself is a little bit more interchangeable, or the service providers themselves are a little bit more interchangeable. Obviously, there's a level of quality that has to be maintained, but you know, it's not quite as custom as it is as a learning experience is, where, you know, the fit between or a caregiving experience for that matter, or the fit between, you know, the sort of provider and the consumer has to be a bit more managed. And so I'm just wondering, you know, from a tutoring perspective, like how do you guys make sure that the right tutor, you know, fits with the right student? And
yeah, like it's critical, right? And when like one of the most defining features of our business is like how you ensure quality, how you know that experience is going to be a good one. And I mentioned at the start, there's like a B2B and a B2C side. Like they're actually quite different in nature, and the B2C is much more parent-led, and I'll speak about that one first. But essentially, there are like a number of steps. Like the first one is like upfront screening. You just get such a volume of applicants, and you can get hundreds of thousands in a month, that you know, particularly in a difficult month, so that you need to like have some sort of upfront screening. But then it becomes increasingly manual. Like we have live one-to-one interviews to check not just is this somebody who's bright, but can they also build a rapport? Can they also convey a complicated idea in an effective way? You check their sort of skills as a teacher, and the pedagogy of one-to-one is much simpler than that of one-to-many, what you'd expect for a teacher. But we're doing more and more now, providing training modules to help people develop those skill sets as well, and really checking for the right mentality. Then after you've done like screening and our interviews, we have these free meetings where parents and we used to pitch them as two-way, but really the tutor can understand if the parent's someone they want to work with. So it is two-way, but ultimately for the parent to understand, like, not just is this a bright, smart, articulate tutor, but also are they the right fit for me? Can we build a rapport? And then we've kept ourselves quite honest by having a pay-as-you-go model, because effectively thereafter you're sort of buying into the next stage each time, and you've got to make sure that it's still a working relationship. You've got to have a clear plan of where it's going to keep going. So we almost have like a 4-stage model up front, and then as we've grown, we've worked out more on the analytics side of like, what does a good trajectory look like as someone applying? So more analytics come in the background, but that initial 4-stage process helped us feel really confident even at the start that we had the quality up to the right standard.
And is there a similar heuristic to what Zarja was describing, where if you present, you know, 5 or 6 options, you know, a parent feels like they're well taken care of and can pick the right, or is that? Yeah,
we probably haven't codified it quite as well as Zarja has, and so that's maybe I sort of what Slava was saying about having a sales team in, like, in reality, like getting somebody like really hooked on a tutor. Once they try it, right, they're delighted with who they found. Like you get somebody who's in, I don't know, somewhere rural, let's say someone in Penzance who's found like a maths tutor, like they're delighted they just found somebody who can do it, who gets on with their child, they don't have to nudge. So like once they actually find somebody, they can get pretty excited, but to actually go as far as booking the free meeting can be a bit of a hurdle. And so if you've got somebody on the phone who can help them understand like why it's a good fit and have that manual interplay, that can break some of the decision loop. But we've definitely played around with lots of different formats, and we haven't found the magic number yet, but constantly trying to find a way to.
Cool. That's interesting. What about you, Slava? How do you guys think about matching teachers and schools and making sure, obviously, you know, that the experience is positive for both sides? And yeah, I'd just love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I think a subset of being very demand constrained is that experience almost always has to be positive for schools. And we over-engineer making sure that happens. And there's a couple of ways we do that. One is, first of all, it's a qualified profession. And so although it's much higher skilled and much more variable than, say, being a delivery driver, because you're professionally qualified to spend 4 years getting QTS, generally you don't get too many outliers in terms of performance. But in terms of the input steps, so we, as a result of putting staff into schools, have to do a 45-minute safeguarding and competency interview with every single person that we choose to vet. So we whittle that list down quite aggressively because that's the step in the vetting process that costs us quite a lot of effort and resources. And then at that step, that's when we really make that assessment. And 45 minutes is quite a long time to really get a feel for somebody. And we try to really work with the top quartile of teachers or so right now because we want to engineer that really good experience for schools. And then after every booking, we get feedback from both sides of the marketplace. So both the schools and the teachers provide feedback after every day. And we really want to understand when that hasn't gone well. And right now we try to engineer that going well 95% plus of the time. And typically when it hasn't gone well, it's been just a matter of the specific pairing not necessarily being the best. And we feed that into our match algorithm and make sure that future pairings then reflect that change in preferences.
Got it. And I know you guys have been experimenting recently. Well, honestly, throughout the course of our investment, you guys have been focused on trying to automate the matching process a bit and getting supply and demand to basically allow teachers and schools to connect more directly, which is increasingly happening. I don't know if you want to talk about that at all, but I think that's been certainly an interesting part of the development over the last couple of years.
Yeah, without going too much into the secret sauce there. So sort of like Netflix, we have a match algorithm that tries to predict with every search how good of a fit somebody is. And generally, I think our magic number is you don't want to get to a list where you just present somebody with 70 teachers and they have to scroll through it. So we generally want people to click somewhere on the first page, which presents you with 10 bookings. And we find the success rate generally is quite high on that.
Cool. No, I think that's super helpful. What about you, Zarja? How do you think about, the fit between, you mentioned that you present 5 or 6 options, but how are you guys evaluating those options and making sure that one of them is actually going to be a fit? And I guess one more specific question for you, have you created personas around nannies and users that you try to match up? Is that part of what you're doing?
Well, when I was doing research on this market and what works and doesn't work, I basically came out of this with 2 insights. One was childcare needs to use technology more in order to be more delightful, more modern, and also more affordable. But the second insight was that finding a nanny is much more like finding your romantic partner, more so than finding your next corporate employee. And that's because the relationship you're going to build with this person is going to be quite intimate. You're going to let this person raise your children when you're not around. You're going to let this person sometimes spend more time in your house than you. You're going to let this person see your dirty laundry, literally and figuratively. So it's the personality match that it's so really important. So what we started doing quite early on is understanding what is compatible in terms of family values, approach to parenting, approach to discipline, communication skills. And so we actually researched the dating industry a lot because at the end of the day, really, it's that personal match that underpins how successful and how long the relationship is going to be between the nanny and the family. And so we continue to learn what exactly are those personality traits that are relevant for the matching, as well as how do we extract them out of people, because a lot of that is subjective. And this was also inspired by this anecdote that happened to me, actually. Me and my best mommy friend, we exchanged nannies. I loved one, and I recommended her to my best friend, and she fired her after a day. Why? How could this happen? She was so good. Well, it turns out that what is good when it comes to childcare is very subjective. And hence, all the matching is really done on subjective levels. Now, we spend a lot of time educating parents that actually it's that subjective match and chemistry that underpins successful relationship, as opposed to whether the nanny has 30 years of experience or 15, whether she speaks French and Mandarin or just English. It continues to be a very interesting evolution of our product.
Yeah, Yeah, because people are complicated. It turns out that's the way. I guess I'm a little bit scared as to what I would be pigeonholed in the consumer. It's like high maintenance or something. But
we can put you through our onboarding process, and I'll see the person that you are.
Okay. All right. Great. That's good to know. Well, I'm realizing that we're running short on time, and I want to give at least the audience the chance to ask one or two questions. So I'll just put that in the minds of the audience now. That if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and I'm going to accelerate our questions and just ask each of you, starting with Slava, just is if there's one exciting change that you're making in the product that you want to talk about, feel free to highlight that. And then if there's a specific piece of advice that you have for other entrepreneurs who are building edtech marketplaces, feel free to shoot. And so obviously make those as short and sweet as you'd like, but like that, we're accelerating this just in the interest of time.
No worries. I'll be super quick. So in terms of one exciting change, we've got two I'll mention. One is for school leaders and multi-academy trust leaders out there. We're shortly going to be releasing dashboards where you can get a more holistic view of your supply spend across schools. And then on the teacher side, we're going to be shortly releasing lots of trainings on specialist subjects that are in demand, specifically around special needs. In terms of one piece of advice, look, I think the world of work is changing and there's going to be an increasing shift to flexible work. And you're going to see a bunch of marketplaces pop up that specifically focus on very deeply vertically focused areas. And I think if you're going to do that, awesome, that's the direction to travel. And it takes a while, so don't give up in the early days. I think it took us 3 months to get our first booking. It's hard work.
Okay. Yeah. No, there are no shortcuts, unfortunately. Yeah. Okay. No, that's super helpful. Thanks, Slava. What about you, Bertie? What do you have kind of in the works that you'd like to talk about, and what advice would you give?
So I guess one of the things I think is particularly exciting in terms of access is to changing, rolling out group tuition. It was one of the things we launched, and it's been super successful. I think some of the social interaction between pupils, especially when they've had time away from school, has been really powerful. So group tuition's a big part of what's coming next for us. And then in terms of advice for people like building a marketplace, for us, it was really important to work out like what our bottleneck was. And then I think really investing in those early relationships, whether they're customers, whether they're tutors, it just gave us a lot more patience for when things went wrong on both sides, and B, I guess, sort of much more transparent feedback loops to really understand sort of what we need to fix and when, than if we'd kept them at arm's length or tried to do it purely sort of, by technical means. And then I guess the quality part, and Slava talked a bit about child safety. I mean, for anything that has a service element, you don't want to get that wrong. So I guess all the excitement around growth, like making sure the really core parts are done properly. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And that's for the record, that's a big part of our due diligence as well. Whenever we invest in companies that have that as a risk. Zarja, what about you? What do you have kind of in the pipeline, and what advice would you give for others?
So the most exciting development that pandemic has accelerated is our offering directly to employers or to employees. So offering our platform as a childcare benefit, employee benefit. A lot of employers are now much more empathetic toward challenges of working parents, regardless of whether they work from home or from the office, because frankly, if you have young kids, even if you work from home, you can't really work. In terms of advice, I think when it comes to people, when it comes to marketplaces where people are involved, not focusing on tech early on, I think actually helps, because you're learning more from people than tech. And I think it's much more important to work out the flows, how your marketplace and matching and sort of experience for both sides is actually going to work. And like with a lot of things tech, like if you just build tech, you can miss a lot of that feedback, and you can very quickly go into the wrong direction. So as much as it's embarrassing sometimes to be doing things manually in the background and are not looking as sexy as Uber or Airbnb, I think it's really critical in order not to waste time and energy.
Yeah, that's interesting. That makes sense. Cool. Well, look, we have one question from the audience, which I will just throw open to the panel, and anybody who feels like they can answer this can take a crack. It says, this is a good question. I don't know what the answer to this is. How do you scale revenue without scaling costs?
Do you scale revenue without scaling costs?
Anybody want to take a crack at that?
I mean, where do we spend too much, I guess, and what can we learn from that? I think we definitely like when I was first starting MyTutor, I very much had sort of read all the sort of Google playbooks of how you sort of optimize, and I think I got very caught up in the mechanics of it, and I sort of built things before I really understood like why, or really grounded them in too much research, and so put product resource and marketing resource into things when I probably should have been frontline, like learning faster and having better feedback loops. So I think like staying close to the customer probably makes it easier to avoid those early misses.
Yeah. Yeah. What about Zarja, Slava? You have any response to that?
I think the best way to grow revenue but not grow cost is to not fundraise, because you can't. No, it's hard.
Create some constraints on the other side, but yeah, it's true.
But as we know, sometimes having too much money can actually be a detriment.
Yeah. Yeah. Slava, anything on your end?
No, I agree with Bertie. You look at where you spend money and you optimize around that, and you have metrics that track the progression over time. And you understand what Zarja said earlier about sometimes it makes a ton of sense to do things manually and spend a bit of cash because it's not the right time to automate something. But as long as you have a plan of how you want to get there, I think it makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the abstract sort of venture capitalist view, which we, where we have the luxury of actually being able to put more capital in often, but I think certainly one of the things we look to, particularly with marketplace businesses, is just, ideally you are developing some kind of network effects over time, and particularly if you're concentrating, your business in a geography or in a particular, demographic that's relatively concentrated. Those should kick in relatively soon. Certainly, we're seeing those at Zen. So I think. Sorry, I'm seeing messages here that I need to end this panel. So sorry, getting distracted. But I think that's something I would also look at as a marketplace business. Okay, guys. Well, thank you so much. Sorry to end this not as gracefully as I'd like, but I really appreciate your time. Hopefully, guys, folks get a lot out of it, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks, Ben.
All right. Thank you, guys. Just we need to make room for the next panel, so click on the top leave button there that you see.
All right, I managed to squeeze in. Thanks, Zarja, Slava, and Bertie, and of course Ben. And sorry to kick you off, but we're happy now to welcome the next panel, who will be joining us with an investor perspective, and it's going to be moderated by Sarah, our associate at Brighteye, who I'm letting onto the stage now, and let the panel introduce themselves with Ben, Shyan, and Ryan. The floor is yours, Sarah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Hege. Great. I'll just wait for everyone to join quickly. I think we have everyone. Brilliant. Okay, well, thanks so much for joining us today. I think we've got quite an interesting variety of perspectives. So I'd love to kick off just by asking you all to introduce yourselves, your funds, what you do, and of course, your interest in or connection to EdTech. So I don't know who wants to go first. Shyan, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot for having me, Sarah. Great to see you again. So just to introduce myself, my name is Shyan Khaleeli. I work at ClearlySo, which is an impact investment bank. We help impactful enterprises and impact funds raise capital, and we also provide them with advisory services. In terms of my connection to EdTech, so I typically focus on EdTech businesses and healthcare businesses that we work with and funds. But also prior to this, I worked at an education publishing company and also worked with private equity, impact private equity fund, Acumen Funds fellowship program.
Cool, thank you very much. I don't know, Benjamin or Ryan, who wants to go next?
I'll go then, thank you. Hi, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. So my name is Benjamin Vedrenne-Cloquet. Although I have a French accent, I live in London. I'm CEO and founder of edtechX Holdings, which is a platform I've co-founded maybe 10 years ago. And we do three things. We invest through NASDAQ-listed SPACs, and we were the first company to launch a edtech-focused SPAC on NASDAQ back in 2018, and we IPO'd the second one in 2020. We also have an investment bank called Ibis Capital, which I'm a partner of, which advise growth edtech companies and future for companies to raise capital or sell or buy. And we also run the edtechX conference series and research. And so in a nutshell, we try to provide capital and light to the edtech ecosystem. And separately, I'm also chairman of an international school in London. So I guess my connection to edtech is pretty obvious. So I'll stop here.
I guess I'll go last. Hi, everyone. I'm Ryan Shea. I'm a director of ventures at Public. Public does a number of things, but we largely exist to bring better technology into the public sector. So we produce research, we run an accelerator. The parts of the business that I look after are our venture investing activities. So where we see opportunities in the market, we'll invest off our own balance sheet. We also do advisory work, mostly with government. So where for my sins, I'm a former strategy consultant, so I still do a little bit of that, but it helps keep me humble.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone. So I think I want to start by looking at the UK specifically. The UK edtech scene. The UK has almost consistently ranked top across Europe in terms of edtech sort of deal number and volumes. However, if you're watching Reese earlier, you will realize that this year the volume is slightly behind, so we've got a little bit of catching up to do. But a lot of this interest is actually coming from generalist investors looking at consumer learning. So I think it's probably interesting to start with Ryan on this one, given your sort of B2G focus. Do you see opportunity elsewhere beyond the kind of consumer learning? Do you think sort of K-12 selling directly to schools is an overlooked opportunity, or do you recognize that there are still some barriers that exist there?
There are definitely barriers. At the end of the day, the sales cycle within K through 12 is a very difficult sales cycle. You're going to, in best case, DFE, MATs. Worst case, you're going school by school to try to get maybe a head teacher to make an investment. But ultimately, I think this space shares a lot of parallels to health. So we do a lot of work in the healthcare space. And I think if you had said before COVID that e-consultations would be the dominant way in which GP consultations would be delivered in the UK, I think people would have laughed at you and said that's 15 years into the future. So obviously COVID precipitated a change in working, but also government then made changes. So they enacted frameworks that made it easier for doctors and trusts to be able to acquire and buy the technology solutions that they need. A similar thing can happen in education. So, while it's not an easy space to crack into in terms of getting on the right frameworks, knowing how to navigate the procurement processes, I think there's a lot of appetite within Department of Education to start to make procurement routes available so that the types of companies that you're seeing today have an easier path to market to be able to scale within K through 12.
Cool, thank you. That's super interesting. And then Shyan, from an impact perspective, where do you see the biggest opportunities in learning technologies? Do you see consumer learning again as an exciting place because of the sort of access to learning as from an impact side, or is there something else?
So I think actually broadly EdTech is pretty well aligned to being impactful, just because it is so focused on outcomes. There is such a focus on learning outcomes and enhancing those, whether it's for your pre-K, your nursery, or actual adult learning as well. So across the board, there's quite a range of ways in which it can be impactful, and that's what we're seeing now. So although obviously at the start of lockdown 1, we saw a flurry of B2C businesses really seeing interest from parents and things like that, echoing Ryan's point, because of COVID and what happened with COVID, as sort of lockdown 2 came about, we saw a lot more schools getting better at being equipped to actually cater to the needs of students who are not necessarily as well served previously, and tech is playing a part in that. And at the same time, things like financial education, etc., are also playing a part. So there's quite a lot happening in the space that we think, works nicely with impact really on the whole.
Yeah, I have to say we've at Brighteye, we've been looking a lot at the kind of intersection of finance and education and different verticals with education. I think there's some interesting opportunities there. And lastly, but certainly not least, Benjamin, as our EdTech expert, where do you see the opportunity, especially in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, it depends how you qualify opportunity. If you have a VC hat, obviously consumer EdTech is great because, adoption is faster and there is more velocity. And I guess that's why there is, more deals done in that space. K-12, there is a huge opportunity that is largely uncracked. But, don't get them wrong. If you look at the Microsoft, the Googles, the Apple, they spend a lot of money there because they know there is a huge opportunity. It's just like velocity and there is a lot of inertia, but that's massive. I think, one area that is a bit under considered is what I call the upskilling or the reskilling and everything that is at the border of, I guess, the job market and higher ed. And, in the US, there is certainly a lot of capital invested in this. We see a lot of, pre-IPO companies being founded in that space. And I think in the UK, there should be more, and there should be more investment in that space as well. So, to me, it's quite promising space.
That's really interesting. I've got to follow on with that with a quick question on this new buzz of the creator economy. Is it all hype, or is it a way of increasing access to opportunity and access to knowledge?
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up on this, I think it's not a hype. I think it's a long rising tide, and what's driving this, I think, is Gen Z. Phenomenon. It's here to last because when you survey Gen Z, they are first they are 75% of the workforce by 2030, right? So they are pretty meaningful to the trend. And second, they don't really believe in a traditional university or college degree anymore. They're much more driven by what I would call purpose economy and creation and their own pursuits, which means as well that they are more likely to hop between jobs, and so twice actually likely to retrain or upskill in between jobs. So I don't think that's a fad. I think it's here to stay, and I think it's a massive trend.
I'd actually add that. So to put a government hat on, increasingly government is thinking about apprenticeships, non-traditional paths that might be greater ROI in terms of getting adults into the workforce without having to pay for a 3-year, 4-year degree. So that's increasingly becoming a focus point for government. So I think not just on the private sector side, but also on the government side, having a new model for that higher education learning, it's increasingly a focus area for policymakers.
That's really interesting perspective. Thank you. Shyan, have you got anything to add there? Or?
I guess also just to add to that, I think it's also happening across a lot broader spectrum. So you're seeing a lot more sort of impact funds, impact investors looking at startups that are looking at blue collar workers and reskilling and changing the skill set that they have and helping them to upskill as well. So it's not just targeted at sort of your Gen Zs, etc. There are more and more opportunities across the board and across age groups around upskilling and reskilling people, and this has obviously just been accelerated right by COVID.
Yeah, I actually think that I totally agree with you. I think there's a huge opportunity in the tech scene in general with a large overlooked demographic. So I think that's exciting. So linked to this and bringing, of course, COVID back into the equation, what would be the panel without mentioning it? And we have seen these rising valuations in the UK and the UK edtech scene starting to look a little bit more like the US in terms of sort of round sizes and valuations. So do you think, should we start with you, Benjamin, that the edtech scene here is experiencing sort of, it is overheated because of the COVID impact, or do you think this is a trend that has just been accelerated and is really here to stay?
Well, so I don't think it's overrated. I mean, I think, the truth is EdTech was a bit of a laggard in terms of funding. And I think it's just a natural catch up that has been basically unlocked by COVID. Just to give you some perspective, when we raised our first SPAC back in 2018, and we're, meaning public equity investors, we had to define what EdTech as. Most people were thinking that we're doing AdTech. This time around, so back in October, November last year, everyone knew what it was. Everyone, had looked at public equity stocks like Chegg and 2Us, etc., and everyone was excited. So there is definitely a change in mindset. When you look at the amount of capital invested in 2020, I think it's $20 billion in venture capital money. I mean, that's twice as much as what was invested in 18. But it's still a drop in the ocean. I mean, the education industry is $5.5 trillion. So, I think I did the math one day, but there's been as much money invested in EdTech than in gaming. And, the education industry is 60 times bigger than the gaming industry. So there's still a lot to go. I think there is, though, some investors that are starting to worry that valuations have hit a very high point. I mean, you look at Coursera, Chegg in public market, we're talking about, 14, 15 times revenues. That's pretty punchy. But I think it's just, a pendulum movement. And I think we're just catching up, which is great. And I'm pleased to see that, and there should be more.
Further to run, which is great news for all of us. Shyan or Ryan, have you got anything to comment on that in terms of valuations?
I mean, I think I just echo Benjamin's point. I think that's completely right. And we are sort of seeing, it's become a much more interesting landscape with a lot more sort of players in the market. So strategics getting involved and private equity. But I think that was really because EdTech was a little bit underloved previously, and COVID has really brought it to the fore.
Yeah, I think, look, you have a paradigm shift of people receiving content in a digital manner. You now, again, to reiterate the health analogy, you now have a population of people who've now been accustomed to receiving educational content through a digital medium. And so what you can now do with that now has opened people's eyes to, possibilities such that, it probably does justify the increased valuation because we're in a very new reality.
Cool, thank you. I see that the screens have gone dark, but I'm hoping that you guys are still with us. So I've just seen that we do have a couple of questions. So I just want to very quickly close with a quick question related to what you were mentioning there with the sort of rise of a different variety of liquidity options. We've seen the increasing private equity involvement, the SPAC model, being proven out with Skillsoft, and Nerdy going public via SPAC. Is liquidity still a concern, or is there a bigger concern that investors and entrepreneurs should be aware of in this space?
I mean, just to give a public market perspective, the reason why we launched SPACs focused on education technology is because there is certainly a scarcity of publicly listed company in that space. I mean, if you look at the combined market cap of all the education and edtech companies, that represent 5% of the total market, education market. You do the same in healthcare, it's 50%. So there is not enough public equity success stories yet, but that's improving massively because, 2 years ago, you maybe have 3 companies that were public. Now you maybe have 30. I mean, most of them are Chinese or Americans. And so people realize that there is an exit path and they are more known to investors. So I think, we're still late and there is still a lot of work to do in terms of liquidity, but, the momentum is there. So I'm not too worried about it. I think it will fix by itself.
Brilliant. Thank you. I don't know if Ryan or Shyan, you've got anything to add on to those. Oh, apparently I've disappeared. hopefully everyone can still hear me. Let me know if you can't. Yeah, if Ryan or Shyan have got anything to add on that point, that would be yeah, that would be great in terms of sort of the barriers in edtech. But I think also there's a question here, which, if conscious we're short of time, that if you can add in on anything that you see around virtual reality and yeah, enhancing, sort of rich enhancement for schools in particular.
I would say for schools, you know, compliant routes to market. I think Department of Education needs to create frameworks that make access to that technology easier, and also gives SMEs the ability to sell their solutions into schools. That those routes to market are very difficult for companies. We've seen that firsthand with companies from our portfolio, from the accelerator, you know, just living that as entrepreneurs within the government technology space. Schools in particular are very hard nut to crack. So what Crown Commercial Services, Department of Education can do to make those procurement routes, those routes to market easier, I think will ultimately be a net good for British edtech, the British edtech ecosystem as a whole.
I mean, just to give one perspective, which is not mine actually, but you know, I had a conversation with Jeff Majan-Calda, who's the CEO of Coursera, and I asked him what's next for Coursera, and he said VR and AR. So that gives you, you know, that's what I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that, because I think, you know, there was a piece of the puzzle missing in terms of education, where the social aspect and the physical aspect of education and learning was missing through sort of the fairly basic sort of systems that were edtech systems that were in place. So there's certainly a piece missing around being social, but also the physicality of the real world, and AR and VR can really solve for that, and you know, make quite a large difference. And companies such as Labster are looking at, you know, solving some of those issues, right? But yeah, I suppose to Ryan's point, you know, selling that sort of tech into schools may be a little bit challenging, but as costs come down, you know, we'll increasingly probably see that in the private market, and then hopefully schools adopting it as government becomes a little more progressive or flexible in terms of their processes.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And I'm afraid we've run out of time. So I'm just going to have to say thank you very much to all of you for your time today, and for, yeah, really interesting discussion, a real variety of opinions and perspectives. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sarah.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks, Sarah.
Wow, thank you each and every one of you, and thanks for all at home joining us. The tour will take a little break over the summer, but we'll get back on the road again in September. We'll keep you posted on exactly when and where to for that. And any other Brighteye news, please subscribe to our newsletter or follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. For example, our new office hours news for honest VC feedback launched this week. I'll post some more info on that in the chat. But for now, I wish you all a beautiful summer. Take some time off, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.